Chapter 1. I spent the last afternoon of before constructing a 1:10,000 scale replica of the Empire State Building from boxes of adult diapers. It was a thing of beauty, really, spanning 5 feet at its base and towering above the cosmetics aisle, with jumbos for the foundation, lights for the observation deck, and meticulously stacked trial sizes for its iconic spire. It was almost perfect, minus one crucial detail. "You used Neverleak," Shelley said, eyeing my craftsmanship with a skeptical frown. "The sales on stay tight." Shelley was the store manager, and her slumped shoulders and dour expression were as much as a part of her uniform as the blue polo shirt we all had to wear. "I thought you said Neverleak," I said, because she had. "Stay tight," she insisted, shaking her head regretfully, as if my tower were a crippling racehorse and she the bearer of the pearl-handled pistol. There was a brief but awkward silence, in which she continued to shake her head and shift her eyes from me to the tower and back to me again. I stared blankly at her, as if completely failing to grasp what she was passive-aggressively implying. "Oh," I said finally. "You mean you want me to do it over?" "It's just that you used Neverleak," she repeated. "No problem. I'll get started right away." With the toe of my regulation black sneakers, I nudged a single box from the tower's foundation. In an instant, the whole magnificent structure was cascading around us, sending a tidal wave of diapers crashing across the floor, boxes caroming off the legs of startled customers, skidding as far as the automatic doors, which slid open, letting the rush of August heat. Shelley's face turned the color of a ripe pomegranate. She should have fired me on the spot, but I knew I'd never be so lucky. I'd been trying to get fired from Smart Aid all summer, and it had proved to be next to impossible. I came in late, repeatedly, and with the flimsiest excuses. I made shockingly incorrect change, even misshelved things on purpose, stocking lotions among laxatives and birth control with baby shampoo. Rarely had I worked so hard at anything, and yet no matter how incompetent I pretended to be, Shelley stubbornly kept me on the payroll. Let me qualify my previous statement. It was next to impossible for me to get fired from Smart Aid. Any other employee would have been out the door a dozen minor infractions ago. It was my first lesson in politics. There are 3 Smart Aids in Inglewood, the small Solemnette Beach town where I live. There are 27 in Sarasota County, and 115 in all of Florida, spreading across the state like some untreatable rash. The reason I couldn't be fired was that my uncles owned every single one of them. The reason I couldn't quit was that working as Smart Aid as your first job had long been a hallowed family tradition. All my campaign of self-sabotage had earned me was an unwinnable feud with Shelley, and the deep and abiding resentment of my co-workers, who, let's face it, were going to resent me anyways, because no matter how many displays I knocked over or customers I shortchanged, one day I was going to inherit a sizable chunk of the company, and they were not. Wading through diapers, Shelley poked her finger into my chest and was about to say something dour when the PA system interrupted her. "Jacob, you have a call on line 2. Jacob, line 2. She glared at me as I backed away, leaving her pomegranate faced amid the ruins of my tower. The employee lounge was dank, windowless room where I found the pharmacy assistant, Linda, nibbling on a crustless sandwich in the vivid glow of the soda machine. She noted at the phone screwed to the wall. "Line 2's for you." Whoever it is sounded freaked. I picked up the dangling receiver. "Jacob, is that you?" "Hi, Grandpa Portman." "Jacob, thank God. I need my key. Where's my key?" He sounded upset, out of breath. "What key?" "Don't play games," he snapped. "You know what key." "You probably just misplaced it." "Your father put you up to this," he said. "Just tell me. He doesn't have to know." "Nobody put me up to anything." I tried to change the subject. Did you take your pills this morning? They're coming for me, understand? I don't know where they found me after all these years, but they did. What am I supposed to fight them with? That goddamn butter knife? It wasn't the first time I heard him talk like this. My grandfather was getting old, and frankly, he was starting to lose it. The signs of his mental decline had been subtle at first, like forgetting to buy groceries or calling my mother by my aunt's name. But over the summer, his encroaching dementia had taken a cruel twist. The fantastic stories he'd invented about his life during the war, the monsters, the enchanted islands, had become completely, oppressively real to him. He'd been especially agitated the last few weeks, and my parents, who feared he was becoming a danger to himself, were seriously considering putting him in a home. For some reason, I was the only one who received these apocalyptic phone calls from him. As usual, I did my best to calm him down. You're safe. Everything's fine. I'll bring over a video for us to watch later. How's that sound? No! Stay where you are! It's not safe here! Grandpa, the monsters aren't coming for you. You killed them all in the war, remember? I turned to face the wall, trying to hide my end of this bizarre conversation from Linda, who shot me a curious glance while pretending to read a fashion magazine. Not all of them, he said. No, I killed a lot, sure, but there are always more. I could hear him banging around his house, opening drawers, slamming things. He was in full meltdown. You stay away, you hear? I'll be fine. Cut out their tongues and stab them in the eye. That's all you gotta do. If I could just find that goddamn key! The key in question opened a giant locker in Grandpa Portman's garage. Inside was a stockpile of guns and knives sufficient to arm a small militia. He'd spent half his life collecting them, traveling out-of-town gun shows, going on lawn hunting trips, and dragging his reluctant family to rifle ranges on Sunday so they can learn to shoot. He loved his guns so much that sometimes he even slept with them. My dad had an old snapshot to prove it. Grandad Portman napping with a pistol in hand. When I asked my dad why Grandpa was so crazy about guns, he said it's something sometimes happened to people who used to be soldiers or who had experienced traumatic things. I guess that after everything my grandfather had been through, he never really felt safe anywhere, not even at home. There already was. Now the delusions and paranoia were starting to get the best of him, it was true. He wasn't safe at home, not with all those guns around. That's why my dad had swept the key. I repeated the lie that I didn't know where it was. There was more swearing and banging as Grandpa Portman stopped around looking for it. Feh! He said finally. Let your father have the key if it's so important to him. Let him have my dead body, too. I got off the phone as politely as I could and then called my dad. Grandpa's flipping out, I told him. Has he taken his pills today? He won't tell me. Doesn't sound like it, though. I heard my dad sigh. Can you stop by and make sure he's okay? I can't get off work right now. My dad volunteered part-time at a bird rescue, where he helped rehabilitate snow egrets hit by cars and pelicans that had swallowed fishhooks. He was an amateur ornithologist and a wannabe nature writer, with a stack of unpublished manuscripts to prove it. Which are real jobs, only if you happen to be married to a woman whose family owns 115 drugstores. Of course, mine was not the realest of jobs either, and it was easy to ditch whenever I felt like it. I said I would go. Thanks, Jake. I promise we'll get this grandpa stuff sorted out soon, okay? All this grandpa stuff. You mean put him in a home, I said. Makes him somebody else's problem. Mom and I haven't decided yet. Of course you have. Jacob. I can handle him, Dad. Really. Maybe now you can, but he's only going to get worse. Fine. Whatever. I hung up and called my friend Ricky for a ride. 10 minutes later, I heard the unmistakable throaty honk of his ancient Crown Victoria in the parking lot. On my way out, I broke the bad news to Shelley. Her tower of state tie would have to wait until tomorrow. Family emergency, I explained. Right, she said. I emerged into the sticky hot evening to find Ricky smoking on the hood of his battered car. Something about his mud-encrusted boots and the way he let smoke curl from his lips and how the sinking sun lit his green hair reminded me of punk redneck James Dean. He was all of those things, a bizarre cross-pollination of subcultures possible only in South Florida. He saw me and leapt off the hood. "You fired yet?" he shouted across the parking lot. "Shh!" I hissed, running towards him. "They don't know my plan." Rinky punched my shoulder in a manner meant to be encouraging, but that nearly snapped my rotator cuff. "Don't worry, Special Ed. There's always tomorrow." He called me Special Ed because I was in a few gifted classes, which were, technically speaking, part of our school's special education curriculum, a subtlety of nomenclature that Ricky found endlessly amusing. There was a friendship, equal parts irritation and cooperation. The cooperation part was an unofficial brains for brawn trade agreement we'd work out in which he'd help me not fail English, in which I'd help them not fail English, and he helped me not get killed by the rode-out sociopaths who prowled the halls of our school. That he made my parents deeply uncomfortable was merely a bonus. He was, I suppose, my best friend, which was a less pathetic way of saying he was my only friend. Ricky kicked the Crown Vic's passenger door, which is how you opened it, and I climbed in. The Vic was amazing, a museum-worthy piece of unintentional folk art. Ricky bought it from the town dump with a jar of quarters, or so he claimed. A Peregrine whose odor even the forest of air freshener trees he'd hung from the mirrors couldn't mask. The seats were armored with duct tape so that errant upholstery springs wouldn't find their way up your ass. Best of all was the interior, a rusted moonscape of holes and dents, the results of a plan to earn extra gas money by allowing drunken partygoers to whack the car with golf clubs for $1 a swing. The only rule, which had not been rigorously enforced, was that you couldn't aim at anything made of glass. The engine rattled to life in a cloud of blue smoke. As we left the parking lot and rolled past the strip malls toward Grandpa Portman's house, I began to worry about what we might find when we got there. Worst case scenario included my grandfather running naked in the street, wielding a hunting rifle, foaming at the mouth in the front lawn, or lying in wait with a blunt object in hand. Anything was possible, and that this would be Ricky's first impression of a man I'd spoken about with reverence made me especially nervous. The sky was turning the color of a fresh bruise when we pulled into my grandfather's subdivision, a bewildering labyrinth of interlocking cul-de-sacs known collectively as Circle Village. We stopped at the guard gate to announce ourselves, but the old man in the booth was snoring and the gate was open, as was often the case, so we just drove in. My phone chirped with a text from my dad asking how things were going, and in the short time it took me to respond, Rinky managed to get us completely, stunningly lost. When I said I had no idea where we were, he cursed and pulled a succession of squealing U-turns, spitting arcs of tobacco juice from his window as I scanned the neighborhood for familiar landmarks. It wasn't easy, even though I'd been to visit my grandfather countless of times growing up, because each house looked like the next, squat and boxy with minor variations, trimmed with aluminum siding or dark 70s wood, or fronted by plaster colonnades that seemed almost delusionally aspirational. Street signs, half of which had been turned blank and blistered white from sun exposure, were little help. The only real landmarks were bizarre and colorful lawn ornaments, of which Circle Village was a veritable open-air museum. Finally, I recognized a mailbox held aloft by a metal butler that, despite a straight back and snooty expression, appeared to be crying tears of rust. I shouted at Ricky to turn left. The Vic's tires screeched and I was flung against the passenger door. The impact must have jarred something loose in my brain, because suddenly directions came rushing back at me. Right at the Flamingo Orgy, left at the multi-ethnic roof of Santa's, straight past the pissing cherubs. When we passed the cherubs, Ricky slowed to a crawl and peered doubtfully at my grandfather's block. There was not a single porch light on, not a TV glowing behind a window, not a town car in a carport. All the neighbors had fled north to escape the punishing summer heat, leaving yard gnomes to drown in lawns that had gone wild and hurricane shutters tight, so that each house looked like a little pastel bomb shelter. Last one on the left, I said. Ricky tapped the accelerator and sputtered down the street. At the fourth or fifth house, we passed an old man watering his lawn. He was as bald as an egg and stood in bathrobe and slippers, sprinkling the ankle-high grass. The house was dark and shuttered like the rest. I turned to look, and he seemed to stare right back. Though he couldn't have, I realized with a small shock, because his eyes were perfectly milky white. That's strange, I thought. Grandpa Portman never mentioned that one of his neighbors was blind. The street ended at a wall of scrub pines, and Ricky hung sharp left into my grandfather's driveway. He cut the engine, got out, and kicked my door open. Our shoes hushed through a dry patch on the porch. I rang the bell and waited. A dog barked somewhere, a lonely sound with the muggy evening. When there was no answer, I banged the door, thinking that maybe the bell had stopped working. Ricky swatted the nets that had begun to clothe us. Maybe he stepped out, I said, grinning. Hot date. Go ahead and laugh, I said. He's got a better shot than we do at any day of the week. This place is crawling with eligible widows. I joked, only to calm my nerves. The quiet made me anxious. I fetched the actor's key from the hiding place in the bushes. Wait here. Hell I am. Why? Because you're 6'5" and have green hair, and my grandfather doesn't know you and owns a lot of guns. Ricky shrugged and stuck another wad of tobacco in his cheek. He went to stretch himself out on a lawn chair as I unlocked the front door and stepped out. Even in the fading light, I could tell the house was a disaster. It looked like it had been ransacked by thieves. Bookshelves and cabinets had been emptied, knickknacks and large print Reader's Digest that had filled them thrown across the floor. Couch cushions and chairs were overturned, the fridge and freezer doors hung open, and their contents melting into sticky puddles on the linoleum. My heart sank. Grandpa Portman had really finally lost his mind. I called his name, but heard nothing. I went from room to room, turning on lights and looking anywhere a paranoid old man might hide from the monsters. Behind furniture, in the attic crawl space, under the workbench in the garage. I even looked behind his weapons cabinet, though of course it was locked, and the handle ringed by scratches where he tried to pick it. Out on the lanai, a gallows of unwatered ferns swung browning in the breeze, while on my knee on this turfed floor, I peered beneath the rattan benches, afraid what I might discover. I saw a gleam of light from the backyard. Running through the screen door, I found a flashlight abandoned in the grass, its beams pointing at the woods that edged my grandfather's yard, a scrubby wilderness of sawtooth palmettos and trash palms that ran for miles between Circle Village and the next subdivision, Century Woods. According to a local legend, the woods were crawling with snakes, raccoons, and wild boar. When I pictured my grandfather out there, lost and raving in nothing but his bathrobe, a black feeling welled up inside me. Every other week there was a new story about some geriatric citizen tripping into retention ponds and being devoured by alligators. The worst case scenario wasn't hard to imagine. I shouted for Ricky, and a moment later he came tearing around the side of the house. Right away he noticed something I hadn't, a long, mean-looking slash in the screen door. He let out a whistle. That's a hell of a cut. Wild pig could have done it, or a bobcat maybe. You should have seen the claws on them things. A peal of savage barking broke out nearby. We both started, then traded nervous glancing. Or a dog, I said. The sound triggered a chain reaction across the neighborhood, and soon barks were coming from every direction. Could be, Ricky said, nodding. I got my .22 in my trunk. You just wait. And we walked off to retrieve it. The barks faded and a chorus of night insects rose up in their place, drowning an alien. A sweat trickled down my face. It was dark now, but the breeze had died, and somehow the air seemed hotter than it had all day. I picked up the flashlight and stepped towards the trees. My grandfather was out there, I was sure of it. But where? I was no tracker, and neither was Ricky. Yet something seemed to guide me anyway. A quickening in my chest, a whisper in the vicious air. Suddenly, I couldn't wait another second. I stomped through the underbrush, like a bloodhound scenting an invisible trail. It's hard to run in a Florida wood, where every square foot not occupied by trees is bristling with thigh-high palmetto spears and nets of entangling skunk vine, but I did my best, calling my grandfather's name and sweeping my flashlight everywhere. I caught a white glint of the corner of my eye and made a beeline for it, but upon closer inspection it turned out to be just a bleached and deflated soccer ball I'd lost years before. I was about to give up and go back for Ricky when I spied a narrow corridor of freshly stomped palmettos not far away. I stepped into it and shone my light around. The leaves were plastered with something dark. My throat went dry. Steeling myself, I began to follow the trail. The farther I went, the more my stomach knotted, as though my body knew what lay ahead and was trying to warn me. And then the trail of flattened brush widened out and I saw him. My grandfather lay face down in a bed of creepers, his legs sprawled out, and one arm twisted beneath him, as if he'd fallen from a great height. I thought surely he was dead. His undershirt was soaked with blood. His pants were torn, and one shoe was missing. For a long moment I just stared, the beam of my flashlight shivering across his body. When I could breathe again, I said his name, but he didn't move. I sank to my knees and pressed the flat of my hand against his back. The blood that soaked through was still warm. I could feel him breathing, ever so shallowly. I slid my arm around him and rolled him onto his back. He was alive, though just barely. His eyes glassy, his face sunken and white. Then I saw the gashes across his midsection and nearly fainted. They were wide and deep and clotted with soil, and the ground where he lay was muddy from blood. I tried to pull the rags of his shirt over the wound without looking at them. I heard Ricky shout from the backyard. "I'm here!" I screamed. And maybe I should have said more, like danger or blood, but I couldn't form the words. All I could think was that grandfathers were supposed to die in beds, in hushed places humming with machines, not in heaps in the sodden reeking ground with ants marching over them, a brass letter opener clutched in one trembling hand. A letter opener. That was all he'd had to defend himself. I slid it from his fingers and he grasped helplessly at air, so I took his hand and held it. My nail-bitten fingers entwined with his, pale and webbed with purple veins. "I have to move you," I told him, sliding one arm under his back and another under his legs. I began to lift, but he moaned and went rigid, so I stopped. I couldn't bear to hurt him. I couldn't leave him either, and there was nothing to do but wait, so I gently brushed loose soil from his arms and face and thinning white hair. That's when I noticed his lips moving. His voice was barely audible, something less than a whisper. I leaned down and put my ears to his lips. He was mumbling, fading in and out of lucidity, shifting between English and Polish. "I don't understand," I whispered. I repeated his name until his eyes seemed to focus on me, and then he drew a sharp breath and said, quietly but clearly, "Go to the island, Jacob. Here it's not safe." It was the old paranoia. I squeezed his hand and assured him we were fine, that he was going to be fine. That's twice in one day that I'd lied to him. I'd asked him what happened, what animal had hurt him, but he wasn't listening. "Go to the island," he repeated. "You'll be safe there. Promise me." "I will. I promise." What else could I say? "I thought I could protect you," he said. "I should have told you a long time ago." I could see the life going out of him. "Told me what?" I said, choking back tears. "There's no time," he whispered. Then he raised his head off the ground, trembling with the effort, and breathed into my ear. "Find the bird, in the loop, on the other side of the old man's grave. September 3rd, 1940. I nodded, but he could see that I didn't understand. With his last bit of strength, he added, "Emerson, The letter. Tell him what happened, Jacob. With that, he sank back, spent and fading. I told him I loved him, and then he seemed to disappear into himself, his gaze drifting past me to the sky, bristling now with stars. A moment later, Ricky crashed out of the underbrush. He saw the old man limp in my arms and fell back a step. Oh, man, oh, Jesus, he said, rubbing his face with his hands as he babbled out about finding a pulse and calling the cops and did you see anything in the woods? The strangest feeling came over me. I let go of my grandfather's body and stood up, every nerve ending tingling with instinct that I didn't know I had. There was something in the woods, all right. I could feel it. There was no moon and no movement in the underbrush, but our own, and yet somehow I knew just when to raise my flashlight and just where to aim it. And for an instant, in a narrow cut of light, I saw a face that had been transplanted directly from my nightmares of my childhood. It stared back with eyes that swam with dark liquid, furrowed trenches of carbon-black loose flesh on its hunched frame, its mouth hinged open grotesquely so that a mass of long, eel-like tongues could wriggle out. I shouted something and then twisted and was gone. Shaking the bush and drawing Ricky's attention, he raised his .22 and pep, 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 saying, "What was that? What the hell was that?" But he hadn't seen it, and I couldn't speak to him, frozen in place as I was, my dying flashlight flickering over the blank wood. And then I must have blacked out because he was saying, "Jacob, Jake, hey Ed, are you okay or what?" And that's the last thing I remember.